Hello, everyone, and welcome back again to our podcast called Learn English with Sam and Pam, where we help you slowly and clearly improve your English listening and speaking skills through natural conversations that feel like real-life situations.
Yes, hello everyone, and we're very happy to have you here with us again today. And in this episode, we're going to focus on something that is extremely important for every English learner in the world, which is motivation, consistency, and how to continue learning English even when you feel tired, confused, or like you are not making fast progress.
This is actually one of the biggest challenges in language learning because many students start with a lot of excitement and energy. They imagine themselves speaking fluently very quickly, but after some time, when they realize that progress is slower than expected, they begin to lose confidence and sometimes even think about stopping completely.
And what is very important to understand here is that this experience is completely normal, and it happens to almost every single learner, no matter their age, their background, or their level, because learning a language is not something that happens in a straight and fast line, but instead it happens in waves, with moments of progress and moments where everything feels slow or even confusing.
Exactly. And if we imagine English learning like a long journey rather than a short trip, then it becomes much easier to understand why patience is so important. Because when you are traveling a long distance, you do not expect to arrive immediately. You expect to walk step by step, sometimes slowly, sometimes faster, but always moving forward, even if the progress is not always visible every single day.
Yes, and I really like that idea of a journey because it helps learners understand that every small action they take, like learning a new word, practicing a sentence, or listening to a short conversation, is actually adding up over time, even if they cannot immediately see the results. And this is why consistency is often more powerful than motivation alone.
Now let's talk more deeply about motivation, because motivation is often misunderstood, and many learners think that motivation is something that should always be strong and present every day. But in reality, motivation is something that naturally comes and goes depending on your mood, your energy, your daily life, and even your environment.
That's right, and this is why relying only on motivation is not a very stable strategy, because if you only study when you feel motivated, then your learning will become irregular. But if you create small habits that you repeat every day regardless of your mood, then your progress becomes much more stable and predictable over time.
For example, instead of saying, "I will study English for 3 hours when I feel motivated," it is much more effective to say, "I will study English for 20 minutes every day, no matter what," because that small daily habit builds discipline, and discipline is what keeps you going when motivation disappears.
And another important thing that we want to highlight is that many learners feel discouraged because they compare themselves to other people who seem more fluent or more confident. But what they do not see is the years of practice, mistakes, and silent learning behind that fluency. So comparison often creates pressure instead of helping progress.
Yes, and if we think carefully, every fluent speaker of English today was once a beginner who struggled with basic words, simple grammar, and pronunciation difficulties. So there is absolutely no reason to feel behind, because everyone starts from zero and builds their level gradually through repetition and exposure.
Now, let's move to another important idea, which is the feeling of not improving, because many students say, "I study English, but I still cannot speak well." And this feeling can be very frustrating, but what they often don't realize is that improvement in language learning is not always visible in the short term.
Exactly, because sometimes your brain is learning even when you feel like nothing is happening. For example, you may not be able to speak perfectly yet, but you might start understanding more words when you listen to English, or you might recognize sentence patterns that were completely new to you before.
And that is why it is very useful to track your progress in a simple way, maybe by writing what you can do now compared to 1 month ago, such as being able to introduce yourself, describe your routine, or understand short conversations, because these small achievements show that learning is actually happening, even if it feels slow.
Another very powerful strategy for learning English is speaking practice, because speaking is the skill that many learners avoid the most due to fear of mistakes. But at the same time, it is also the skill that improves your English the fastest when you practice it regularly.
Yes, and it is very important to understand that making mistakes while speaking is not a sign of failure, but instead it is a natural and necessary part of learning, because every mistake gives your brain information about what to correct next time, and this process slowly builds accuracy and confidence.
One simple way to practice speaking without pressure is to talk to yourself in English in your daily life. For example, you can describe what you are doing while cooking, walking, or cleaning. And even if the sentences are simple, like "I am making tea" or "I am going to the shop," this still trains your brain to think in English instead of translating from your native language.
And another useful method is shadowing, where you listen to a short sentence or dialogue and immediately repeat it exactly the same way, focusing on pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation, because this helps your mouth and ears adapt naturally to English sounds over time.
Now let's also talk about negative thoughts, because many learners experience moments where they think English is too difficult for me, or I will never be fluent. But it is very important to understand that these are emotional thoughts, not objective facts.
Yes, and when you notice these thoughts, you can gently replace them with more realistic and supportive thoughts, like "I am improving step by step," or "I am learning something new every day," because the way you talk to yourself can strongly influence your motivation and confidence.
Another key point is creating an English-friendly environment, because the more you expose yourself to English in your daily life, the more natural it becomes. For example, by listening to English podcasts, watching short videos, or even changing your phone settings to English so that you see the language all the time without pressure.
And what is interesting is that even passive exposure, like listening without fully understanding everything, is still useful because your brain gradually becomes familiar with the sounds, structures, and rhythm of the language. And this familiarity later helps you understand more easily when you actively study.
We also want to emphasize that discipline is more reliable than motivation, because disciplined learners continue studying even on days when they feel lazy or distracted, and this consistency over time is what creates real progress and fluency.
And learning can also become much easier when you make it enjoyable, because if you connect English with things you like, such as music, movies, sports, or personal interests, then your brain becomes more engaged and you naturally remember vocabulary and expressions better.
So, at the end of today's discussion, the most important message we want to share is that learning English is not about being perfect or fast, but about continuing steadily, even when progress feels slow or invisible, because every small effort you make today becomes part of your future fluency.
And even if sometimes you stop for a few days or feel unmotivated, what truly matters is that you always come back and continue. Because learning a language is not about never stopping. It's about always returning and continuing the journey, step by step, word by word, and sentence by sentence, even when the path feels unclear and you are still trying to understand how everything connects, and you are practicing again and again, and slowly building confidence, and trying to speak more naturally, and listening more carefully, and repeating more often, and noticing small improvements, and sometimes feeling stuck but still continuing, because learning English is not a straight line, but a living process that keeps going, and we are still here with you, and we will continue this conversation, and maybe next we can explore how you can
And maybe next we can explore how you can build a strong daily English routine that actually fits into a busy life. Because many learners think they need hours every day, but in reality, even a small, well-structured routine can create powerful long-term results if it is repeated consistently and with focus.
Yes, and I think this is something very important to explain clearly because a lot of people give up not because English is too hard, but because they believe they do not have enough time, when in fact the real issue is not time, but how that time is used. Because even 15 or 20 minutes a day, if used properly, can create real improvement over weeks and months.
Exactly. And if we break it down in a simple way, a good routine does not need to be complicated at all. For example, you can start with a short listening practice where you hear natural English for a few minutes, then you repeat some sentences out loud, and finally you try to produce 1 or 2 simple sentences yourself about your day or your thoughts.
And what is powerful about this kind of structure is that it combines listening, speaking, and thinking in English at the same time. So your brain is not only receiving information passively, but it is actively processing and producing language, which is exactly what builds fluency over time.
Another important idea we should talk about is the fear of not being understood, because many learners avoid speaking because they worry that people will not understand them. But in real communication, clarity is often more important than perfection, and even simple sentences can successfully communicate meaning if they are spoken with confidence and patience.
Yes, and actually, most conversations in daily life are based on simple language, not complicated grammar. So when you say things like, "I need help," "I don't understand," or "Can you repeat, please?" you are already using very effective communication strategies that native speakers also use in different situations.
And this brings us to another key point, which is that communication is not about impressing people with complex sentences, but about exchanging ideas clearly. And once learners realize this, they become much more relaxed when speaking because they stop trying to be perfect and start focusing on being understood.
Now let's talk about listening skills in more detail, because many learners think listening is just about understanding every word. But in reality, listening is about training your brain to catch meaning from context, tone, and familiar expressions, even when you do not understand everything that is being said.
Yes, and this is why repeated listening is so useful, because the first time you listen to something you might understand only a little, but the second and third time your brain starts to recognize patterns, and suddenly words that were unclear before become more familiar and easier to understand.
And it is also important not to panic when you do not understand, because confusion is a natural part of learning, and every time you listen to something difficult, your brain is actually being trained to adapt, even if you do not notice immediate results.
Another thing we should mention is the importance of self-patience with yourself, because many learners are very strict with themselves and expect fast results. But language learning is a slow transformation process where your understanding, speaking ability, and confidence all develop at different speeds.
Yes, and sometimes you will notice that your listening improves before you're speaking, or your reading improves before you're listening. And this is completely normal because each skill develops in its own rhythm, and over time they slowly start to balance each other out.
Let's also talk about vocabulary in a more practical way, because instead of trying to memorize long lists of random words, it is much more effective to learn words in real sentences that you can actually use in daily life, because context helps your brain store and recall information more easily.
For example, instead of just learning the word improve, you can learn it in a sentence like, "I want to improve my English every day," because this way you are not only learning the meaning of the word, but also how it naturally fits into a real communication situation.
And when you repeat these sentences in different contexts, your brain starts to build a network of meaning. So instead of thinking word by word, you begin to think in chunks of language, which is a very important step towards fluency.
Now let's go back to motivation again, because even with good strategies, there will always be days when you feel low energy or disconnected from learning. And in those moments, it's important to remember that progress doesn't depend on big actions, but on small, consistent returns to the language.
Yes, and even something as simple as listening to one short English audio or repeating 5 sentences out loud can be enough to maintain your connection with the language, because the goal is not perfection every day, but continuity over time.
And I think it's also helpful to accept that learning is not always exciting, because sometimes it feels repetitive or slow, but that repetition is actually what builds long-term memory and automatic understanding, even if it doesn't feel very exciting in the moment.
Another important habit is self-reflection, where you take a moment to think about what you learned recently, what you can already do, and what still feels difficult. Because this awareness helps you guide your learning more effectively, instead of just studying randomly without direction.
And when learners do this regularly, they often realize that they have actually improved more than they thought, because they were too focused on their mistakes and not focused enough on their progress, which changes their mindset in a very positive way.
Now, let's talk about real-life application, because English becomes much more powerful when you use it in real situations, even in small ways, like thinking in English while planning your day, or describing objects around you, or even mentally translating your thoughts into simple English sentences.
Yes, and this kind of mental practice is extremely useful because it slowly builds the habit of thinking in English instead of translating from your native language, and that shift is one of the biggest milestones in becoming more fluent and natural.
We should also mention that mistakes are not something to avoid, but something to use as feedback. Because every time you make a mistake, you are actually discovering a gap in your knowledge that you can now improve, which means mistakes are part of progress, not the opposite of it.
And over time, as you make more attempts to speak and express yourself, your sentences become smoother, your vocabulary becomes more flexible, and your confidence grows naturally, even if you do not notice it every single day.
So, if we summarize this part of our conversation, we can say that successful English learning is built on simple habits, daily exposure, willingness to make mistakes, and the ability to continue even when motivation is low or progress feels invisible.
And most importantly, it's about staying connected to the language in a way that feels sustainable, not stressful. Because when learning becomes part of your daily life instead of a heavy task, you naturally improve without forcing yourself too much.
And as we continue this series, we will go even deeper into practical speaking strategies, real-life conversation practice, and how to train your brain to respond faster in English without translating everything in your head first. And we are still not finished here, because there is much more to explore about how you can build confidence in real conversations. But for today, we want to slowly bring everything together and close this episode with a few final thoughts that you can take with you into your learning journey.
Yes, and if you listened until this point, we really want to remind you that the most important message from everything we discussed today is that English learning is not about speed, it's about direction and consistency, and even if your progress feels slow, it is still progress as long as you keep showing up and practicing in small ways every day.
Exactly. And you don't need perfect conditions to learn English. You don't need perfect motivation, and you don't need perfect confidence, because learning actually happens in imperfect moments, when you are a little tired, a little unsure, but still willing to try again and continue even with simple sentences and small efforts.
And we also want you to remember that every learner has moments of doubt. Every learner has days where they feel stuck, and every learner sometimes feels like stopping. But the difference between those who improve and those who quit is not talent, it is simply the decision to return and continue one more time, even if it is just for a few minutes.
So if today you take only one idea from this episode, let it be this: keep your English learning simple, keep it consistent, and keep it alive in your daily life. Because even small actions like listening, repeating, speaking to yourself, or reading a short sentence can slowly build something very strong over time.
And we are really happy to be part of your journey, even in a small way through this podcast. And we hope that when you feel unmotivated or tired, you remember that learning is not a straight road, but a continuous return, a continuous practice, and a continuous step forward, even if it feels very small in the moment.
So thank you for spending this time with us today. Thank you for listening, and most importantly, thank you for not giving up. Because every time you choose to continue, you are building a stronger version of your English skills without even realizing it yet.
And we will be here with you in the next episode, where we will continue exploring more practical ways to improve your speaking, your listening, and your confidence in real conversations, step by step, slowly and clearly, just like always.